Last week's revelations about the Vatican's sanctions against Theodore McCarrick surfaced in what is being called the Figueiredo Report, named after Monsignor Anthony Figueiredo, a former aide to McCarrick, who leaked the correspondence between the disgraced cardinal and the Vatican. Also last week, Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin announced that the investigation of McCarrick's crime is ongoing, without giving a deadline. Now, this after the Pope's vehement denial that he had any knowledge of McCarrick's transgressions. Why hasn't this investigation wrapped up? And even more perplexing, why Theodore McCarrick rose to the heights he did in his long career. Joining me now with analysis of all of this is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, here in studio, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD MURRAY. Gentlemen, thank you both for being with me. Regarding the Figueiredo Report, gentlemen, do you expect that we will see more information about McCarrick and others being leaked like this in the future? Robert Royal.
I think it's certainly possible, because one of the things that Father Figueiredo says in his report is that he's following the advice of Pope Francis himself in his document Vox Estis Lux Mundi, which is that we should be the light of the world, and that it is time, because of the crisis of abuse in the Church, for anyone who has knowledge about anything that's gone on to come forward.
Right.
In fact, in a certain way, you could almost say that retroactively this allows someone like Archbishop Vigano to come forward, because he felt, whether rightly or wrongly, he felt that something was going wrong. I'd be very surprised if we don't hear some other reports from other areas. Father Figueiredo himself has said that he has other material that he may bring out in reports. Whether we will get documentation from the Vatican itself, anyone knows at this point. We, as you rightly say, Cardinal Parolin has promised this, but it is going on, and it's almost a year now that the initial bombshell about McCarrick came out, and I don't think we're any closer publicly to knowing what happened.
Via Vigano, yeah. Father Murray, is this a way for the Vatican to be pressured to admit what's going on about these accused clerics and what action they're taking?
It certainly is, Raymond, and it's interesting that Cardinal Parolin only gave the update on the status of the investigation after the Figueiredo report hit the internet. Really, I question the way the Vatican is handling this, because information is not forthcoming. It only seems to be reactive when it comes to people like Father Figueiredo's report. And it's interesting because what Figueiredo has done is reveal something that was certainly known to many people in the Vatican, and who knows who in the Archdiocese of Washington. This was known many, many months ago. In that revelation by Figueiredo, there's reference to a letter from Cardinal Ray to Cardinal McCarrick regarding the restrictions being placed on him. And as you read, McCarrick said that he brought this to the attention of Cardinal Wuerl. So we have here elements that make Archbishop Vigano's account, again, proven to be accurate. And I think what Figueiredo has done is put more pressure on those involved to come clean. But we'll see if more revelations come. I think Bob is right. There probably will be some more.
Now, Bob, in the papal interview with that Mexican journalist last week, the Pope insisted he knew nothing about McCarrick or the charges against him. Now, given what Father just talked about, these revelations that Cardinal Ray had actually memorialized these sanctions, your thoughts on that denial?
Well, actually, it's a little ambivalent, because in one version of the text that came out, he said he knew absolutely nothing.
Right.
But actually, in the interview, he says, I don't recall whether when I met with him, or if I did meet with him, whether we talked about this or not. So it's a kind of ambivalent situation whether he says he knew about it or not. But we do know, and I think one of the real strengths of the Figueiredo report is he says specifically there's this letter of that date that was sent to this person, and that they can be found probably in the files in the nunciature here in Washington, or in Rome at the Congregation for Bishops. So when a man starts to put those kinds of specifics out there, this gives us a little bit more to grab onto. Now, the problem, and I want to say to the viewers, a lot of people, I hear from them, they're frustrated. They feel that Rome is never going to do anything, and that may be what eventually happens. But we have to continue to follow up on this. People tell me they're tired of hearing about it and they wish we'd go on to something else. But we can't. I mean, this goes to the very credibility of the Church's own internal governance of itself. And unless this is, I think that the Vatican is making a big mistake if it does not expedite whatever it can put out there that'll give us some explanation for how this happened and why there was not a follow-up after 2008 to keep Cardinal McCarrick sort of in line.
Well, what did we learn, Father Jerry, in that interview with the Pope? Did you learn anything there about that meeting with Archbishop Vigano, where Vigano contends in June of, I think it was 2013, he told the Pope about McCarrick because he was asked about McCarrick?
Yes, well, this is a very interesting part of the interview. The Pope first says he knew nothing, absolutely nothing, obviously, he says, about McCarrick, but then he says he can't remember if Vigano told him about McCarrick or not. Now, if you knew nothing, then you basically would have to say that he didn't tell me, because otherwise you would have known something.
Right.
Now, is Vigano lying about what he told the Pope? I doubt that, because the information that Vigano said he told the Pope is actually proven to be true. So what we have here is a conflict of testimonies between the Pope and Vigano, and I think it's worth, as Bob says, that the Vatican follow up on this. Maybe help refresh the Pope's memory. Did he talk to anybody afterwards about the Vigano interview that took place in June of 2013? One thing, though, we're learning, and this really is, I think, something that is causing anxiety in the Church in general, is that the Pope is managing information through journalists. He even said back in August of 2018 that it's up to the journalists to find out the truth about the Vigano memo. Well, the journalists have their role in the Church, and that's very good, but it's the role of those who govern the Church to provide accurate information based on what they know, not to simply respond when journalists come along. So I think we've learned that the information flow and stream and management here is not satisfactory.
Well, and speaking as a journalist who's been covering this stuff now for decades, it's far easier and better if you have the information to be forthcoming, put your spin on it, but release it so everybody can see it. When we have to go digging around, what happens is it creates camps. And journalists, because we're the messengers, inevitably become we're downstream and we're targeted. And you're attacking the Pope, you're attacking this one, you're attacking that one. We're not attacking anybody. We're trying to figure out what's going on in the absence of full disclosure. That's what's happening. And Bob, when you see this, the frustration you're talking about from your readers, what I hear from our viewers, they're very frustrated because that information is being held back and we're not getting the full story. And that irritates people. And it irritates them because we're supporting this. And one gets the feeling what we're sitting on top of is not just Cardinal McCarrick, but a string and a network of bishops, archbishops, cardinals who facilitated and benefited from his ascension. That's what's going on here. And unless that is disproven, that's where the people, that's the feeling they have as they watch this dribble out and unfold. Now, Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, in the aftermath of this interview with the Mexican journalist, he said just last week, he told the press, the Vatican is still investigating McCarrick. And he said this: we've said many times that they are making an investigation which consists of gathering together all the documentation regarding this case. But he offered no clarification about the awareness of the restrictions of the timeline for an investigation. He only said once this work is done, there'll be a declaration. Is that enough, Robert Royal?
I think for most ordinary Catholics, it's not going to be enough because they don't get a chance to parse out these, the arcana of these sorts of things as we do. Look, we have to accept, the Pope says he doesn't remember, and we have to take as positive a view of a person denying something as we possibly can, although I must say it does seem implausible. Phil Lawler has made I think the telling point that if an old friend tells you he studied French in high school, and 5 years later you ask, he says, don't you remember I told you? You say, well, it's not all that important. But if he says, I wrestled a bear when I was in high school, you don't forget that. And I think if somebody tells you that a Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C. is involved with sexual shenanigans with seminarians, you don't forget that. On top of that, whether at that moment the Pope knew about this or not, certainly when the Vigano testimony came out in 2018, in which he said he told the Holy Father, there's a file this thick on McCarrick at the Congregation for Bishops. I think the minute that you read that, you call up Cardinal Ouellet at the Congregation for Bishops and say, can you please bring that file over and let's look it over. Is this true? Is this not true? If it's true, then this is explosive. And it goes back before Francis. It certainly, it isn't only under Pope Francis that this problem has existed. So I get the impression from a lot of Catholics that the longer this goes on, and I think this is very regrettable, they begin to suspect all bishops as being part of the kind of cover-up that you're talking about, and it's not true.
That's not true, and that needs to be dispelled for the good of the church, the local church, and the universal church. Father Jerry, why is this investigation taking so long, since we know where these files are? And how much pressure is the Vatican under now?
Well, I think the Vatican is under more pressure now because of the two things that happened last week, the Figueiredo revelation plus the interview with the Mexican journalist. Now let's look at the facts here. Cardinal McCarrick, former Cardinal McCarrick, was investigated by the Archdiocese of New York for 9 months, and then it was found credible that he had abused a seminarian. Subsequent to that, the Vatican took on the case, and then approximately 7 months later, he was found guilty. So therefore, we have two investigations which undoubtedly gathered a lot of evidence. In the meantime, Cardinal DiNardo announced that the American bishops were going to try to get to the bottom of what happened. And then the 4 dioceses where McCarrick had worked, New York, Metuchen, Newark, and Washington, also announced that they were going to investigate their files. Cardinal Ouellet announced in September of 2018, we're going to review all our files. Now, all of that, 6 different, 4 different, however many it is, 6, 7 different entities have looked at McCarrick, and we're in June now, and we still don't have even a brief summary of what was found. All we have is the charge sheet, which was then found to be in the trial that occurred, but none of those dioceses have released reports. The USCCB hasn't sent anything out, and the Vatican says they're still working on it. I have a feeling that if there was that thick file that Bob referred to, that they had already centralized most things about McCarrick and the Congregation of Bishops. So I think let's just say this, justice in the church should not be reactive and slow. It should be proactive, and it should be done with the proper speed in order to answer legitimate questions. Was McCarrick being protected by anybody in the church? And why was the reason he was being protected? And if he wasn't being protected, then show us the reason why people acted in ignorance.
Yeah, before I leave this topic, because we have a lot to get to, Bob, I have been getting calls since last week. And they're similar to the ones I fielded back when we reported the Vigano revelations. How can you report on this person? Did you know? And they immediately begin attacking the character or dredging up old stories about Vigano and now Monsignor Figueiredo. Now, look, I don't know the full disclosure on any of these stories. We don't know. But that's almost immaterial. Is what they're bringing forward valid? Are these documents valid? That's all that matters. Look, when you're trying mobsters, you're not looking for choir boys and Mother Teresa's order to testify against them. You deal with the people who were there and saw and touched and felt the situation. That's what we're dealing with here. That's how I feel about this. Why is the whistleblower suddenly on trial?
Exactly. And look, we have the thing I think that Figueiredo has done that no one else has done to this degree is he lays out specifics. He says that, for example, that the strictures that were placed on McCarrick were that he was not to travel, he was not to appear in public, and he was not to go to Rome. And it was the third thing that McCarrick said they tried to negotiate because he felt that he had a right as a cardinal to come to Rome periodically. So we see specifics like that. And then he draws from that some conclusions that I think are simply inescapable and someone has got to respond to, because the longer that they're out there, it doesn't matter if he's a perfect reporter or not. He's placed specific truths out there that can be confirmed or denied. When a guy does that, to me, he's put his credibility on the line, and you can find out whether he's telling the truth or a lie.
Go ahead, disprove it. But the burden of proof is on those who are attacking. We have to talk about the Gustavo Zanchetta case. Now, this is the Argentine archbishop who was charged with sexual misconduct of seminarians, having porn on his phone, and financial improprieties. He's now being investigated formally by the Vatican. Last December, director of the Holy See Press Office, Alessandro Gisotti, said the Vatican only learned about these accusations of sexual immorality in the fall of 2018. But in this latest interview, Pope Francis said he knew about the phone pornography before that. The first reports of the pornographic photos were sent to the Vatican in 2015. In 2017, the Pope asked son Chetta to resign as Bishop of Argentina. He says he sent him to therapy, and then he brought him to Rome to oversee church property. Father Jerry, your thoughts, and how difficult a situation is this for Pope Francis, who's from Argentina, and clearly knew about the charges against son Chetta?
Well, again, this is very disturbing from the point of view of a timeline and a series of facts. You've outlined them very well. When the press officer of the Vatican, Gisotti, said in December that they only knew about these charges regarding this bishop in the fall of 2018, that is prone to be manifestly untrue. The Pope himself said that he met with Chetta and that he understood the charges were made. The Pope makes the statement that Chetta told him his phone was hacked, and the Pope said he made a convincing case, and there was a doubt, therefore I let him go. I didn't punish him for that. Now, once the Pope says that, Gisotti really has to get in front of the cameras and say, well, why did he tell us in 2018 that there was no knowledge of this previous to that point? There was. And in fact, the accusers, when they heard Gisotti's comments, they were outraged, because this wasn't as if there were no complaints and then the Pope took him out and did something for no real reason. So the credibility of the entire Vatican communication operation is called into question. And then also, let's look at the facts. There was pornographic images that were found on the telephone of a Catholic bishop, including involving himself. And he makes an allegation that he has been hacked. That is a standard defense mechanism that we've seen in other cases that guilty people make. Now we also learned from the Pope that the initial investigation of Chetta is complete, and now he's being subject to a trial at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That trial can only be about sexual abuse of minors, because that is indeed the competence that the Doctrine of the Faith has in these matters. So it's not about the fact that he was a bossy bishop or didn't get along with his priests.
Which was the contention, part of it
Which
anyway.
was a contention that was made, but no, in fact, he's now subject to criminal investigation by the Argentine state as regards sexual abuse of minors. So this is a very serious matter, and we really should look back and say, why didn't the Holy See deal with this in a much more upfront fashion, giving him a job working in the administrative office of the Vatican patrimony? I mean, this guy has been subject to so many accusations leading up to that basically, as the Pope said, it looks like they were parking him somewhere and hoped that nothing came out. Turns out a lot came out.
Bob, it is frustrating having to cover this stuff, I have to say. I wish we could cover uplifting things, but the fact is we're dealing with this fire hose of information every week, and it's revelation after revelation after revelation, but it comes out in bits. We're not getting an authoritative drop here. Is that part of what this is and the frustration everybody's feeling?
Yeah, and I think part of it also, though, is that the Holy Father is by nature a kind of man who is gentler and wants to think the best of people.
Right.
So
Mercy. He wants to be merciful.
He knew Chetta personally. They worked together at the Argentine Bishops' Conference. I even think that he at one point was Chetta's spiritual director or something like that. So Chetta comes with him with this preposterous story that his phone has been hacked. I mean, I talked to somebody who deals with Chinese and Russian hacking and whatnot this past week, and they said, look, it's technically possible. But for a couple of your ecclesial enemies in a small diocese in Argentina to hack into a guy's phone and put images there, and as Father rightly says, some images were of him involved.
That's a trick.
It's very implausible. Well, we've seen the same thing happen in Chile with the Barros case, and then I think maybe even the McCarrick case may reflect this element in the Holy Father, which I think also existed to a certain extent in Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict imposed those restrictions on McCarrick. But then when it was very clear, I mean, it was notorious that he was traveling around the world and doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing, somehow there was no follow-through. So You can be gentlemanly, you can be kind, you can be merciful, but that isn't always the best thing for the actual victims of who these people are that you're trying to
when the church is crying out for justice, it's best to give it to them. Now, during the latest interview, the Pope also pointed out that there have been allegations of abuse by Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga of Honduras. He's a member of the consultation of cardinals, the 9 cardinals that consult with the Pope. He said, the poor man will get things from every side, and there's nothing proven. No, he's honest, and I made sure to find out things. In this case, it's calumnies. Father Jerry, your thought on what is said there. Has there been an investigation into Maradiaga for us to know whether what the Pope is saying is true or not?
Well, this has shades of the Barros case, if I can make an analogy. The Pope defended Barros. The Pope believed Barros that he was innocent. The Pope is very friendly with Maradiaga. That's a well-known fact. He confides in him a lot. He's the head of that C9, now C6 group of cardinals. But now we're informed by the Pope himself that he has looked into the matter. No one's brought him charges. It reminds me of what the Pope said about Barros. He used the same word, calumny. And he said this was filmed during his trip in Chile where some people were protesting. The Pope said, no one's brought me any evidence against against Barros. Now the question is, how would anybody bring evidence aside from a denunciation they might make on their own if the Pope doesn't announce that he's seeking evidence, that he needs evidence because he's been given disturbing reports? The seminary, of course, in his diocese there in Honduras was subject to a great upheaval because 50 seminarians wrote a letter saying there was a homosexual cabal at the seminary. His auxiliary bishop, Pineda, was accused of being an active homosexual, and there was, in fact, an investigation done by a retired Argentinian bishop of Pineda, and then a year or so later, Pineda was removed. He resigned from the office of auxiliary. Now, Pineda was known not to be a stranger, but a close friend of Maradiaga's. So what did Maradiaga know about Pineda? What did Maradiaga know about the seminary? You know, one of the seminarians made an accusation in a column by Edward Penton of the Register. The seminarian said, if you went against what was happening in the seminary, you were thrown out, you were removed. So that's an abuse of authority. That's certainly a case where you can say people are subject to undue pressure. So again, with the Pope saying that Maradiaga is being calumniated by his enemies, well, you know, Holy Father, you said the same thing about Barros. Isn't it time that you do what you did in the Barros case? Appoint someone like Scicluna. Archbishop Scicluna went to Chile. Should he go now down to Honduras and take testimony? Because if you don't ask publicly for testimony, you're only going to get it if people feel strong enough to give it to you. They need to be invited to do that.
I want to move on before we run out of time to what's happening, the international picture, particularly what we're seeing in the EU. After last week's stunning elections, the Pope described the rise of the Salvini party in Italy, the Farage party, Brexit party in the UK, and Le Pen in France as an anti-immigrant meanness. Is that what we're witnessing there, Robert Royal?
I think it's unfortunate that he uses a term like that because it's very clear that a lot of these people welcome a certain type of immigrant or a certain number of immigrants, but they know that their countries feel threatened by the uncontrolled illegal immigration that's going on.
And that's what the Pope was speaking to, refugees and migrants, and he said they're mean toward them.
And he thinks that there should be an opening up of the gates. Look, in England, in the UK, Neil Farage's Brexit party, which is 6 weeks old, took 33% of the vote.
Oh, it's incredible.
In Italy, Salvini, who lots of people compare to President Trump, he's a rough character, but he gets things done, and he has a lot of people behind him. Salvini and his allies in government took almost 60% of the vote.
Unbelievable.
In France, Marine Le Pen, who some people think is a member of a far-right party. I'm not exactly sure that that's the right way to describe it, but she takes a slight victory over the sitting president, Emmanuel Macron, who was elected with 66% of the vote just 2 years ago in France. So you look at this, and it's not as if the Italians are mean or the British are mean. There's a threat that people feel that you can say, you should be more welcoming and whatnot, but yes, they would like to be welcoming, they like to take care of their neighbors, but they see that this is not simply a matter of Christian charity and receiving the stranger and the refugee among you. There's something else going on here.
Speaking of the stranger and welcoming the stranger, the Pope spoke particularly about the Trump wall. And in the interview, he said this: "We knew of one of Berlin and the many headaches and sufferings it caused us. But it appears that man does what animals don't. No, man is the only animal that falls twice into the same hole. No, we are returning to the same thing. No, building walls as if it were a defense. No, defense is dialogue, growth, acceptance, and education, integration." Your thoughts, Father Jerry?
Well, again, this is a matter where the Catholic people have complete legitimate right to take a course of action that may not be the one preferred by others, including some ecclesiastics. The regulation of immigration is part of the social order. Every society has a right in law and in morality to regulate who comes into that society from outside of it. And the mass phenomenon of illegal immigration in the United States, the problem of the same thing in Southern Europe, these are things where people who disagree with a open arms, open borders approach, they should never be taught by ecclesiastics, in my opinion, that they are doing something mean, sinful, or wrong by saying, no, we don't want everybody who shows up at the border to be allowed to walk across and stay here. There's got to be some regulation. Otherwise, you're basically saying our society as a whole has no existence that we can regulate and defend. Now, we have a great history in the United States, for instance, of taking care of people who are refugees from, truly horrible situations. Think about all the Vietnamese who came after the end of the Vietnam War. But we should not say anybody who walks in here across the border illegally, they have an automatic right to stay, and they have an automatic right to the benefits of living in the United States. There's no moral imperative to do that. We do have to uphold the rule of law, and true charity is regulated according to justice on all sides.
Well, and in the United States context, to welcome 1 million people in every year as citizens, that seems pretty welcoming. That's more than any other country's doing.
And that's, of course, through legal means.
I mean, those are legal immigrants.
The comparison with the Berlin Wall is unfortunate again, too, because the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall were not intended to keep people out. They were intended to keep people in who wanted to flee.
That's right.
We run a program in the Slovak Republic every year, and we often take students down to the point where Slovakia and Austria meet. And that was the border between East and West for many years. The Morava River flows down into the Danube there, and people died with makeshift scuba equipment, hang gliders, they braved dogs, guards with machine guns, simply to try to escape a horrible regime like communism. So there's a difference. I mean, our wall, if one ever gets built on the southern border, is not intended to close us in. It's intended to get some control over a terrible situation, not only for the United States, but for the people who are coming there as well.
Well, look, I've spent days down at the border, and I'm telling you, with Border Patrol, and I can tell you, they're under intense strain. It's a very small group of people who are charged with patrolling that border. They need the time to get to where drug runners are coming in, people are being smuggled in. When you've just got an open border, they can run across in the dead of night. They can distract you with people in a river here while they're moving people across by speedboat a mile away. If the wall's in place, that slows down the traffic and makes it manageable. That's all that's happening here, and it's silly to characterize it elsewhere. I've got to get into this very quickly. The Pope spoke about the political situation today and the reasons for immigration. He said this: in the political world, there's something that does not work. There is something that does not work, and deep down, I believe that the base is environmental mistreatment and economic abuse. I mean, all the fortune is concentrated in quite small groups in relations to the others, and the poor are more. So, of course, the poor seek borders, seek out new horizons, do they not? I think that is the origin, right? The economic wear and tear, right? Bob, and then Father Jerry, quickly.
Yeah, that's true, of course, I think, specific contexts, that there are places, particularly in Latin America where the Pope is from, there are places where the very heights of the society are very wealthy, and then there's just a vast amount of poverty. That's generally not the case throughout the world. And in fact, globalization is, everybody who, I don't know very much about economics, but anybody who studies global economics will tell you that over the last 30, 40, 50 years, these last decades, the percentage of poor people in the world is actually going down. That many more people are moving out of abject poverty into reasonably decent circumstances because of the kind of global economic system that we have. It also creates problems, but then again, all systems create problems along the way. So I think that to kind of read this as an economic, it's almost like a Marxist reading of what drives peoples in history. I think it's a little bit skewed from what the reality is actually in the world at this moment.
Father Jerry?
Yes, and I would say that the Pope also leaves out warfare and the great problem of Islamic fanaticism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all the rest. I mean, you have this great problem in the Middle East of the persecution of Christians. They've had to flee. Africa, tremendous problems in Nigeria and other countries from Islamic fanatics. Warfare has produced a tremendous amount of displaced persons. In general, though, we have to say that the economic analysis that poverty is increasing, as Bob says, on a global scale, that's simply not true. In individual cases, yes, that may be the reality, but a large reason that we have so much immigration now are modern transportation systems, because you have to face the fact the people who are leaving the southern shore of the Mediterranean to go north, they're paying lots of money to get on boats, and they're trying to evade, the Coast Guard of the various nations. So there's a lot of immigration that simply is people trafficking, and then educated people with money who don't want to live in their country anymore.
Right.
Cardinal Sarah said we should create situations where people don't want to leave their countries, and I think that's, getting back to the question of political corruption, the rule of law. We should focus on that.
Right, and letting them rebuild the common good in their homeland, which is their true birthright. Thank you both, Father Jerry, Robert, thank you for being here. As always, you can find the commentary for Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray at thecatholicthing.org. Thank you, Posse.